Mr. Speaker, in early 2020, the full impact of COVID on our country could not have been foretold. The global pandemic brought on by the COVID-19 virus forced us to shelter in place, while learning and schooling as we knew it would not be the same. In short order, our island home went from moving along with everyday life to one where the effects of a global pandemic disrupted our lives in ways never previously imagined. Mr. Speaker, from an education perspective, with schools closed, we were forced virtually overnight into remote learning. While remote learning by itself will never be an adequate substitute for the richness of face-to-face learning, it was all we and other education systems worldwide had. The ugly face of inequalities, which often lie within our shores hidden, became glaringly apparent. Some of us had the luxury of internet-capable devices and access to the internet, critical components of remote learning, and others did not. And rather working with printed material that had to be collected from schools or delivered by mail, or utilizing the technological solutions put in place, all parents and families grappled with the newness of managing and supporting their child's learning. And they did so while also juggling their employment and uncertainty of navigating a global pandemic. It would be true to say that the educational setbacks were felt much harder for some than others. Mr. Speaker, this government was determined to get our children and young people back into the classroom as quickly and safely as possible. This was not only the morally correct thing to do to close any growing or potential learning gaps, but also because the island needed to begin to recover and move forward from the effects of the pandemic. As a result of the pandemic, tens of millions of dollars had to be found to support Bermudians who could not work. So yes, getting our children back to school for September 2020 was a high priority. Mr. Speaker, at the start of the new school year in 2020, Bermuda achieved what countries 100 times our size could not. We opened our school buildings for in-class learning. This was not without its challenges, as we were still learning about the best ways to fight COVID, and like the rest of the world, we were learning about the best mitigation strategies to keep our young people safe while engaged with in-person learning. I am proud to say that this government has never wavered in its commitment to protecting the safety and health of our learners and our educators. Mr. Speaker, throughout 2020 and 2021, we have learned a lot about this virus and the best ways to prevent contracting it. A variety of strategies to help avoid unnecessary exposure have served us well, with vaccinations and home antigen tests more recently supplementing mask wearing, social distancing, and hand sanitizing. While a vocal minority will differ in their thoughts, these tried and true methods of avoiding unnecessary exposure are effective. They have been proven to work to limit us from infection. Our colleagues from the Ministry of Health have often reminded us of the Swiss cheese model. While no single intervention or mitigation strategy is perfect in preventing exposure to COVID, as they all have holes, but having multiple layers of intervention in place increases our chances of success. This is equally applicable in school settings. Mr. Speaker, we now find ourselves in 2022, and as we move forward towards living safely with COVID as a nation, we must balance our desire, some may even say impatience, to relax all COVID restrictions. However, within education, we must never forget our ultimate goal, and that is keeping our students safely in school for in-class learning. It is appropriate to remind ourselves of the global evidence around us. It has been established that a young person is more likely to meet the learning and well-being outcomes they desire and need to succeed in the world if they have an opportunity to engage with in-school learning. An opportunity to engage with high-quality instructional in social learning settings. That is, they are engaged within school learning. Our policies must and always start with this in mind as we seek to balance this between this and living safely with COVID. Mr. Speaker, I get it. Honestly, I do. I get the emails. I get the social media posts, the private Facebook campaigns, the pressure put on honorable members by their constituents, the daily newspaper's gratuitous allowance of letters to the editor, and the occasional reporter-led story. Still, as Minister of Education, I remain committed to the ultimate goal that all of us should strive for, and that is to keep our students in the classroom. Something, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be the first thing mentioned in the spaces I just mentioned previously. Mr. Speaker, some insist that all COVID mitigation strategies in school must be removed completely and immediately. This would fly in the face of what we know will help us achieve our ultimate desire, that is keeping our students in the classroom. I remind colleagues and the listening public that a positive COVID test result will lead to a period of quarantine. A student or teacher that tests positive must quarantine, regardless of their age, whether they are from public or private school, from back of town or fairylands, black or white, live in multi-generational households or not, or any combination of these. I do, however, acknowledge that we must find ways to move into a space that gives our schools a feeling of greater sense of normalcy. Movement in this direction, Mr. Speaker, will not come without risks, and those risks must be balanced. If too many teachers are out simultaneously, schools will be forced to close. If the spread of COVID amongst children increases, we will begin to see further learning losses. We do not want to go backwards with students in and out of the classroom due to increased positive cases. This is unacceptable and should be unacceptable to my colleagues in this House and the listening public. Mr. Speaker, I think it is also important to remind honorable colleagues and the listening public that the majority of positive cases of students are a result of their activities outside of school. We desire to detect positive cases before they enter the school via screening programs. We also want to protect staff and students from being exposed to COVID in school by the use of mitigation policies and isolation of any person found to be positive. I'm thankful for a study that was forwarded to me last night from the American Academy of Pediatrics titled School Masking Policies in Secondary SARS Transmission. In the March 2022 publishing of this study, the findings were that secondary infections, and those infections that come from people who are already positive, in school districts with optional mask wearing policies are 3.6 times higher than in districts with mask wearing policies. So, Mr. Speaker, far too often I receive messages from a vocal minority that wishes to compare COVID restrictions to a relaxation in bars, restaurants, football games, parties, and events, etc. We also hear the threats from a particular segment of our community of the financial impact the island will feel if they decide to move away from the island or send their children to boarding school if we do not drop COVID restrictions in schools immediately. Unfortunately, even members of this House and in the other place are repeating these messages. Just yesterday, Senator Ben Smith, when referring to COVID guidelines in schools, said in the other place, people are going into restaurants where they can remove their masks and sit, eat, and drink. And he followed up by saying there is an economic impact as more people are making decisions to find other methods of education and sending their children away earlier. Mr. Speaker, I remind colleagues and the public and the listening public that going into a restaurant to eat or attending a party or function and going maskless is optional. You are putting yourself at a risk of exposure, but you accept that risk. You turn up positive, quarantine for 5 to 7 days, work from home remotely, and for those who are fortunate to have jobs that allow them to work remotely. As I've gone to great pains to get us to recognize we want our children in school, and going to school is not an option. I urge those who continue to compare a school to a restaurant, a bar, a club, or a concert, please stop doing that. It is simply an apples to oranges comparison. Mr. Speaker, our children are too precious to deliberately expose them to COVID-19 because we can now eat at a restaurant without a mask on. When speaking of economic impact, what about the economic impact of families who can't afford to be home on quarantine because a child was exposed unnecessarily? For once, I would like people to stop, think, and understand that we are here to govern for everyone, not just to speak certain people's desires and needs. Mr. Speaker, this morning, schools were advised of the relaxation of some COVID-related restrictions. These modifications will permit an optional removal of masks within classrooms and school grounds, the mixing of bubbles, parents and visitors on school grounds, sports days, and other things. Effectively returning to the kinds of formative experiences we want all young people to have while at school. These relaxations, however, come with a great and shared responsibility, a responsibility that all staff, parents, learners, and the community must accept to prevent exposure that can result in catching COVID. It is everyone's responsibility to positively demonstrate and continue the behaviors that we know reduce the spread of COVID. Mr. Speaker, these revised guidelines consider school population's usage of the at-home screening programs or the saliva screening program. We must have effective measures in place that allow the detection of any COVID-positive staff or student as soon as possible. School families that have high adherence to screening policies will enjoy fewer restrictions than those that do not. While current mask wearing for those who have high participation rates will be changed to optional in most circumstances, it is still recommended that to increase your ability to avoid exposure, people make personal choices to wear them as often as possible. There needs to be a shift from government-mandated safety measures to personal responsibility for yourself and those around you. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the members of the Education Emergency Measures Committee, the EEMC. They have provided feedback to help evolve the 2021-22 COVID phases for school protocols. This document was released this morning. Some proposals find themselves in the documents, others do not. However, I want to clarify to colleagues and the listening public that this revised guideline document is the sole responsibility of the Minister of Education and can and will be changed as necessary to continue to protect our children and keep them in school buildings. As a result, I fully understand and accept, even if others do not or refuse to, that the relaxation of mask wearing will most likely lead to more COVID-positive cases in our school system, which can lead to more students missing critical in-class learning. Mr. Speaker, regardless of the changes in the restrictions, we must continue to do everything that we can to slow the spread of the virus, as, despite the thoughts of some, we are still in a pandemic. That means wearing a mask, physically distancing, and practicing hand sanitizing. I will continue to urge that we take all the precautions possible to avoid exposure. This government is committed to finding ways to balance keeping our children in school for in-class learning while learning to live safely with COVID. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.